In the dense woods of Ohio, hidden from the world, there lies an old amusement park known as Lake Shawnee. The park has been abandoned for decades, swallowed by nature, with rusting rides and crumbling attractions standing like gravestones in a forgotten graveyard. But those who dare venture there know that Lake Shawnee is not truly abandoned. Something still lingers in the shadows, something restless, waiting. The story begins with the Ferris wheel, that once stood proudly against the sky, now a skeletal structure covered in vines. Local legend has it that the park was built on an ancient Native American burial ground, and from the moment it opened, a dark cloud hung over it. Accidents happened frequently, too frequently to be mere coincidences. The most chilling of these was the tragic death of a young girl, whose spirit is said to haunt the grounds to this day. On a crisp autumn afternoon, long before the park closed its gates forever, the Ferris wheel was filled with laughter and excitement. Families gathered, children ran freely, and a little girl in a bright pink dress begged her mother to let her ride the Ferris wheel. Her eyes sparkled with joy as she climbed into one of the brightly colored carts. She waved to her mother as the wheel began to turn, slowly lifting her up into the crisp blue sky. As the wheel turned, something changed. A cold wind swept through the park, sending shivers down the spines of those below. The wheel creaked and groaned, a sound that echoed like a scream through the empty spaces. Suddenly, without warning, the wheel came to a jolting stop. Panic spread among the riders, but the little girl's cart swayed more violently than the others. The bolts holding it in place began to rattle and shake, as if some unseen force was trying to wrench it free. The girl's mother screamed from below, her cries piercing the air, but her voice was drowned out by a deafening snap as the cart broke free. Time seemed to slow as the cart plummeted toward the ground. It crashed with a sickening thud, and silence fell over the park. The little girl's body lay motionless, her pink dress stained with blood. The park never recovered from that day. One by one, the rides stopped turning, the laughter faded, and Lake Shawnee was left to rot. But the girl in the pink dress never left. They say her spirit remains, trapped between this world and the next, reliving that final moment over and over again. Those brave enough, or foolish enough, to enter the park after dark often speak of strange occurrences. A ghostly figure in a pink dress seen near the Ferris wheel, a child's laughter echoing through the empty air, or the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Some have even reported seeing the Ferris wheel move on its own, slowly turning as if powered by some supernatural force. One night, a group of teenagers decided to test their courage. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they sneaked into the park, their footsteps echoing against the cold, hard ground. As they approached the Ferris wheel, a chill swept over them, colder than the autumn air. Their flashlights flickered, and they heard the faint sound of a child giggling. They paused, their breath visible in the frigid air. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered, his voice trembling. They scanned their surroundings, but there was no one in sight. Just the skeletal Ferris wheel looming above them, its shadow stretching across the cracked earth. Suddenly, the wheel began to creak. The sound was slow at first, like a door opening on rusty hinges. Then it grew louder, more insistent, until it was a deafening screech that echoed through the empty park. The teenagers froze in terror as the Ferris wheel started to turn, its rusty gears grinding against each other. One of the carts began to sway, just as it had on that fateful day so many years ago. Then they saw her, a figure in a pink dress standing at the base of the Ferris wheel, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to look right through them. She reached out a hand, her fingers long and skeletal, and pointed directly at them. A chill ran down their spines as they realized she wasn't looking at them. She was looking through them, as if seeing something far beyond their mortal comprehension. The air grew thick with a sense of dread, and the teenagers could feel a presence surrounding them, pressing in from all sides. Panic set in, and they turned to flee, but the ground beneath them seemed to shift and move, as if the very earth was trying to trap them in place. The sound of the Ferris wheel grew louder, and over it they could hear a child's laughter, high and clear, but tinged with a note of sorrow. One by one their flashlights went out, plunging them into darkness. They stumbled and fell, their screams swallowed by the night. The only light came from the Ferris wheel, now glowing with an eerie, unnatural light, casting long shadows across the ground. The figure in the pink dress stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. She raised her hand once more, and with a sound like the rushing of wind, the Ferris wheel spun faster and faster, the carts whipping around in a frenzy. The teenagers could feel a force pulling them toward it, an unseen hand dragging them closer to the spinning wheel. Just as it seemed they would be pulled into the wheel's deadly embrace, the lights on the Ferris wheel flickered and went out. The air grew still, and the figure in the pink dress vanished, leaving only the echo of her laughter behind. The teenagers lay on the ground, trembling, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. They scrambled to their feet and ran, not stopping until they were clear of the park. As they reached the safety of the road, they turned back for one last look. In the distance, they could see the Ferris wheel, now still and dark against the night sky. But they could still hear her laughter, faint and haunting, carried on the wind. To this day, Lake Shawnee remains abandoned, a place of shadows and whispers where the past and present collide in a chilling dance of death. And those who dare to venture there know that the girl in the pink dress is still waiting, forever trapped in that final terrifying moment, her spirit bound to the Ferris wheel that took her life. Conneaut Lake Park in Pennsylvania was once a lively destination, a place where families would gather to laugh, play, and create memories. Now it stands as a crumbling relic of its former self, shrouded in darkness and mystery. The park has been abandoned for years, left to decay in solitude. However, something still lingers there, something that should have been left in peace. The local legend speaks of the Carousel of Shadows, an old, decrepit ride at the center of the park. The wooden horses, now rotting and weathered, still seem to be galloping toward some unknown destination. But it's not just the eerie sight of the ride that sends chills down the spine of those who dare to venture near. No. It's the story of little Tommy that haunts this place, a story that remains etched in the memories of the town's oldest residents. In the summer of the 1930s, a young boy named Tommy was visiting the park with his family. He was a cheerful child, always eager to explore. But that day, something changed. The moment he saw the carousel, his eyes lit up with excitement. He ran towards it, shouting for his mother to let him ride. She hesitated, sensing something off about the place, but the laughter and joy of other children convinced her to let him go. Tommy climbed onto one of the painted horses, a beautiful white steed with a golden mane. The ride started slowly at first, the music echoing through the park. But as the carousel picked up speed, something strange happened. The air grew cold, and the laughter of the children seemed to distort into something darker, more sinister. Tommy's mother watched in horror as the lights around the carousel flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ground. She called out to her son, but her voice was lost in the chilling wind that swept through the park. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the carousel stopped. The music came to a screeching halt, and a deafening silence filled the air. The other children ran off the ride, frightened, but Tommy was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in as his mother and the park staff searched every inch of the carousel, but there was no trace of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The police were called, and a massive search ensued, but Tommy was never found. After that day, the park began to change. Strange things started happening, things that couldn't be explained. The carousel, which was closed off after Tommy's disappearance, would often start spinning on its own, the haunting melody of the organ grinding out a tune that no one wanted to hear. Visitors reported feeling a cold presence near the ride, a heavy sense of dread that would wash over them without warning. Some claimed to hear whispers in the wind, soft voices calling out for help, voices that sounded eerily like a child's. The years passed, and the park was eventually abandoned. But the stories didn't stop. Paranormal investigators, Thrill seekers and curious onlookers have all come to Conneaut Lake Park, hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural. Most leave with more questions than answers, but some leave with stories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. One such group of investigators decided to spend the night near the carousel. They were well prepared, armed with cameras, recording devices, and a strong sense of skepticism. As the sun set, they set up their equipment around the ride, laughing and joking about the ghost stories. But as darkness fell, the laughter faded, replaced by a tense silence. The carousel stood motionless in the moonlight, its once bright colors now faded and peeling. The investigators felt a chill in the air, a sudden drop in temperature that seemed unnatural. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, noticed something moving out of the corner of her eye. She turned her flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there, just the shadows cast by the trees and the decrepit old ride. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The investigators were beginning to pack up, disappointed by the lack of activity when they heard it, a faint sound, like the distant laughter of a child. They froze, listening intently. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the empty park. Then, without warning, the carousel lights flickered to life, casting a ghostly glow across the grounds. The ride began to move, slowly at first, creaking and groaning as if protesting against the intrusion. The investigators stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide with fear. The carousel picked up speed, the haunting melody of the organ filling the air once more. But this time, it was different. The music was warped, distorted, as if played by unseen hands. The wooden horses moved up and down, their eyes seeming to follow the group, filled with a lifelike intensity that sent shivers down their spines. Sarah stepped closer, her camera trained on the ride. As she did, she saw a small figure standing in the shadows just beyond the carousel's reach. It was a boy, no more than 8 years old, his face pale and expressionless. He stared at her with eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness, his mouth moving as if whispering something she couldn't hear. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The others nodded, fear etched on their faces. They could all see him, the ghostly figure of Tommy, standing there, staring at them with hollow eyes. One of the investigators called out to him, asking if he needed help, but the boy didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised his hand, pointing towards the carousel. The ride suddenly jolted to a stop, the music cutting off abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of footsteps, soft, barely audible, but getting closer. The investigators turned to see the boy walking towards them, his footsteps leaving no mark on the ground. Panic set in. They tried to move, but it was as if their feet were glued to the ground. The boy stopped just a few feet away, his cold gaze fixed on them. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Help me," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Please, help me." Before they could react, the lights on the carousel flickered again, and the ride began to spin violently. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the temperature plummeted. The investigators felt a force pushing them back, away from the ride and the boy. Suddenly, the boy let out a scream, a blood-curdling, heart-wrenching scream that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. The investigators covered their ears, their hearts racing with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The wind stopped, the carousel ground to a halt, and the boy was gone. The park was silent once more, the only sound the ragged breathing of the investigators. They quickly gathered their equipment, their hands shaking, and fled the park, vowing never to return. But the memory of that night would stay with them forever. The memory of the haunted carousel and the ghostly boy who had been lost to its shadows. Imagine a place once filled with the joyous sounds of children splashing and laughter echoing off the colorful slides. Now picture that same place, but instead of laughter, all that fills the air is an eerie silence, broken only by the wind whispering through rusted gates. This is Nara Dreamland, an abandoned water park in the outskirts of Japan, where time has stopped. and something far darker has taken over. The park had closed its doors in 2006, unable to keep up with the competition or the financial strain. But if you ask the locals, they'll tell you that the real reason for its closure is buried in something far more sinister, something that still lingers in the shadows, waiting. It is said that Nara Dreamland was built on land that should never have been disturbed, a cursed ground with a past too dark to speak of. One cold, moonless night, a group of urban explorers decided to test their bravery by venturing into the abandoned park. They were drawn by the allure of mystery, by tales of strange noises and ghostly figures seen wandering the slides and empty pools. The group of 5, armed with only flashlights and the thrill of adventure, sneaked past the rusted gates, their footsteps crunching on the overgrown weeds that had begun to reclaim the once lively park. As they walked deeper into the heart of the water park, a heavy fog began to settle in, wrapping around them like a damp, cold shroud. The air felt thick, as if filled with unseen eyes watching their every move. The explorers laughed it off at first, teasing each other about ghost stories, but there was something else there, something none of them could ignore for long. The atmosphere was charged, almost alive with a presence they couldn't quite put into words. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of water splashing echoed through the park. The group froze. They knew every pool and slide was bone dry, drained of water years ago. And yet, they heard it, clear as day. The sound of someone or something moving through water. They shone their flashlights toward the largest pool, which lay in front of them like a giant gaping mouth. As they approached, they could see the surface of the pool's concrete floor was slick, shining as if wet. Then, to their horror, they saw fresh, wet footprints slowly appear one by one, leading away from the pool. The prints were small, like those of a child, yet there were no children here, only the dark, oppressive night and the creeping fog that seemed to grow thicker with each step they took. Trying to make sense of what they were seeing, one of the explorers, a girl named Yuki, stepped forward to get a closer look. The air grew colder, and a sudden chill ran down her spine. She turned to her friends, her voice barely a whisper. "We should leave. Something's not right." Just as she spoke, a low, guttural growl filled the air, reverberating through the empty park. It was unlike any animal sound they had ever heard, a noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Panic set in, and they decided to head back the way they came, toward the entrance, their flashlights shaking in their trembling hands. But as they turned to leave, they heard it again, the splashing of water. Only this time, it was louder, closer. The sound followed them, seeming to come from behind, yet every time they glanced back, there was nothing. Just shadows and fog, thickening like a living thing, swallowing the path they had just walked. Breathing heavily, they stumbled into the old locker rooms, thinking it would be a shortcut back to the entrance. The smell of mold and decay hit them like a wave, and the fog seemed to grow even denser, clinging to their skin like a cold sweat. The flickering beam of their flashlights caught glimpses of broken tiles and shattered mirrors, remnants of a place that once held life. And then, all at once, the locker room lights flickered on, casting a sickly greenish glow over everything. They stopped, frozen in place, their reflections staring back at them from the cracked and filthy mirrors. But as they watched, the reflections began to change. In the mirror, behind their reflections, they could see figures, pale, shadowy, with eyes glowing a deep, unsettling red. Children, their faces blank, their eyes empty, standing silently, watching. And then, slowly, their faces twisted into grotesque grins, mouths stretching unnaturally wide. Suddenly, the door to the locker room slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound of children giggling filled the air, a sweet yet sinister melody that seemed to bounce off the walls, growing louder and louder until it was unbearable. The explorers pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The lights began to flicker again, faster and faster, plunging the room into a chaotic dance of light and shadow. One of the explorers, a boy named Hero, turned his flashlight toward the mirror, his hands shaking so badly the light bounced wildly. His breath caught in his throat as he saw a figure standing right behind him in the reflection. A child in a soaked swimsuit, water dripping from her hair, her eyes glowing red, her lips parted in a silent scream. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, fog-filled room. Panic turned to terror. They felt trapped, as if the walls were closing in. The temperature dropped even more, and their breath came out in visible puffs of steam. Suddenly, the giggling stopped, and the lights went out completely, plunging them into total darkness. In the blackness, they heard a voice, a whisper, soft and childlike. "Come play with us," it said, echoing through the room. Forever. With a final surge of adrenaline, Yuki managed to force the door open, and they all burst out, tripping over each other in their haste to escape. They didn't stop running until they were outside the park's gates, the fog lifting as they crossed the threshold, the oppressive weight that had been bearing down on them suddenly gone. They never spoke of what they saw that night, but each one knew they had encountered something beyond comprehension, something that lurked in the shadows of Nara Dreamland, waiting for the next group of curious souls to wander in.